Welcome to At Work in America, sponsored by Paychex. At Work in America digs in behind the headlines and trends to the stories of real people making a difference in the world of work. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Bowes and Trish Steed.
Welcome to the At Work in America podcast. We are the longest running and top downloaded HR podcast for 15 years. Welcome. We're glad you're with us. Trish, good morning. How are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you this morning?
I am fantastic as well. I'm excited for today's conversation on a topic that's really important, one we've covered a couple of times, but we're coming at it from a whole new angle, which are women's rights, particularly around menopause and employment discrimination related to menopause. And it's going to be a fantastic conversation.
It is. And I think that whether you are on the employer side, you're a leader, a business owner, or whether you're an employee who is female or who works with females, this is a show truly for everyone. Don't let the menopause word scare you, because you're going to end up knowing more and being able to do some really actionable things in your workplace. So
Yeah,
very
so
excited for this one.
you definitely want to tune in to this one for sure. And I want to thank our friends at Paychex. I'm wearing my Paychex hat today. If you happen to be catching this on YouTube, this episode about Work in America, sponsored by our friends at Paychex, one of the leading providers of HR, payroll, retirement, and insurance solutions for businesses of all sizes. Everyone, it is the end of the year. You're wrapping up 2024, getting ready to start 2025. All kinds of year-end tasks in HR and in payroll, and it can be a little overwhelming, especially when you're trying to manage all the fun stuff, right? That happens at holiday time. Don't worry though, our friends at Paycheck once again have crafted an amazing year-end compliance guide that can be used for you for your year-end roadmap, whether it's taxes, benefits, or staffing. Their guide is packed with tips and checklists to help keep you ahead of deadlines and avoid any pesky penalties. You don't want to start 2025 without reading up on this. So head over to paychex.com/AWIA. That's paychex.com/AWIA. Grab your free copy today. Thanks to our friends at Paychex for doing that once again.
And if you are not familiar with Paychex, they have so many free resources, and definitely consider them as your provider as well, because it's things like this where they come to you with information before you need it so
Yeah.
that you're prepared. So mark your calendar, every November, they're going to come out with a new guide for you to prepare you for the year ahead.
Yep, awesome stuff. So thanks to them. And yeah, this is going to be a fantastic show. Women's rights, menopause, employment discrimination. We're talking to a couple lawyers on this topic, but I'm going to tell you what, this is not boring legal speak. This is a
Not
fun,
at all.
interesting, informative conversation. So stay tuned for that and enjoy the show. We are excited to welcome our guests today. We have Jack Tuckner and Catherine Crider here to talk about women's rights and menopause employment discrimination. Jack is a women's rights in the workplace attorney and a founding partner of Tucker, Sipser, Weinstock and Sipser LLP, a New York-based law firm dedicated to workplace gender rights. With over 20 years of experience, Jack advocates for working women at all stages of the reproductive life cycle, from pregnancy through menopause. Jack, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Steve. I'm doing well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to
Appreciate it.
have you. And we also have Catherine with us, Catherine Crider, who was admitted to the California bar in 2015. In addition to being a lawyer, Catherine is an active labor and postpartum doula helping families. When she's not working with families one-on-one, she teaches childbirth education and postpartum classes for new parents across the United States. Catherine, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here today.
Yeah, we are excited to have you. It's a great topic. We've covered it a couple times on the At Work America show, and great to come at it from a slightly different angle today. And Jack, I'll start with you. How did you go down this path of your legal practice? It's a little different. I mean, you could be like doing high stakes mergers and acquisitions, litigation, right? It's a lot of things you could
Exactly.
do as a lawyer. What took you down this path?
Well, it's a great question, Steve. That was never for me, the high-powered corporate world. In fact, I dropped out of college. I was in a conservatory studying acting for 2 years. I was definitely not someone who I hated lawyers like everybody else does, and for good reason. And I've always been, a liberal and kind of the type of, hate bullies and been sort of the underdog oriented guy. And by the way, I grew up in a particularly loving matriarchal household. When
Nice.
I'm an old white guy, I'm saying people say like, what are you doing here in this space? They've been saying to me that for 25 years, actually, I've been particularly in this space.
Right.
Well, I'm old enough to remember my mom needing my dad's permission to get a credit card. And I was like, what? In this household where the couple of men, my aunts, my mom, the cousins, all women, were the empathetic, smart folks, and the couple of men were the schleppers. So it was like, well, I've never understood that whole notion my whole life, and I've never lost this sort of sense of how is it that men wouldn't put up with this, and how are we so diminishing women in all the ways that we do? But the trajectory wasn't straight. I was an actor. I went back when I finally went back to school. I became a public defender in the Bronx in New
Mm,
York, which was really where I kind of got my experience for about 7 years of trial work. And then I was looking for where are my talents needed in terms of actually helping people. I went to a public interest law school. It was really all about, you know, people oriented, people over profits. And,
yeah.
again, not great with money, but this was what drove me. And I realized at some point in the 90s that women, again, are the largest minority majority in the country, and nobody's in that space dealing with gender pay disparity, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination, which is rampant back
Right.
then.
Yeah.
So that was really what kind of started it out for me, and I've been happily plying that professional trade since.
Catherine,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Trish.
right.
Let's get a little background from Catherine too. Like same sort of question to you, Catherine. Like how did you sort of get into this field?
Thanks, Steve. So I was actually a teacher. I thought my trajectory was I was going to be a classroom teacher, but then I realized that I wanted to do more on the policy side. So I went to law school at night, and I actually switched to teaching preschool during the day so that I didn't have to lesson plan and grade at night. And so through that, I actually ended up becoming a doula as the families at the preschool started having their second, third children. And I realized that we did need advocacy and some of the struggles that people were going through. And so that actually ultimately led a lot of my legal journey. And interestingly, Jack's firm was one of the few firms that focuses specifically on women's rights issues. And so that kind of helped me find my way to him.
I love both of your backgrounds and sort of how for me, we hear from a lot of especially people that are currently students, and they're not sure what they want to be. And I think we all have that story. You go to school for one thing and you might go down a different path as you get into the working world. So for me, that's good to hear that you don't have to necessarily know exactly what you want to do and be whenever you're in college. One question I have, I'll start with you, Jack. So I think that as we've been doing more shows on menopause, and as someone who's gone through it myself, it's something that a lot of women don't even realize how early it starts. It can start in your mid 30s, some of these symptoms. And I think that we're maybe a little more familiar with pay equity issues for women. That's been a little more front and center. So could you talk a little bit about some of the legal practices that you have specifically around women in that, say, perimenopause to menopause age? Because that really covers a woman from like mid 30s all the way to maybe 60 or so, right? It's a
Mhm.
large chunk of your career. What kinds of issues are popping up? Because I don't even know that I would know that that's something that could be covered or protected.
Well, the kind of the Cliff's Notes version of this now, we could get into how we got here and how this relates to pregnancy discrimination and what's going on behind the scenes with legislation we're working on. But here's kind of the upshot for now, even right now, when symptoms of perimenopause and menopause affect so-called major life activities such as sleeping, thinking, eating, walking, working. Let's just say sleeping. Insomnia is a big symptom for these bookend stages of a woman's reproductive life cycle. When you have something that affects a major life activity like sleeping, let's say insomnia, or a major bodily function, what's a major bodily function? The endocrine system, always in flux. This is what's going on in perimenopause and menopause with the diminution of endogenous estradiols, etc. And one goes to a menopause-aware practitioner or your OBGYN who is menopause certified or aware, and you are now, and you know that this is what's going on in the myriad symptoms you have of brain fog and hot flashes and emotional issues, anxiety, neurological, all the many symptoms. Now you have a diagnosis, if you will. Menopause and perimenopause are medical conditions related to a woman's reproductive life cycle. And when you have these symptoms, you're entitled to say to your employer, I am covered by, and this is true, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act of 2008, which broadened the ADA substantially, says that any condition that you have that affects a major life activity or a major bodily function, you're entitled to flexibility from your employer, unless your employer can show that, oh no, we can't do that. That would be such an undue hardship on our business, which is a high bar for an employer. So the request itself is protected activity under the civil rights laws in our country. People don't really understand that. They either self-exile if they get frustrated, or to give you, I don't know if I may, and I only actually I don't even know if I may. I had a DM recently from a woman who summarizes what people go through. I don't know if it makes sense for me to read this
Please
because
do.
Yeah.
so, and I'm reading this with permission from this woman who DM'd me on LinkedIn, where I'm constantly, doing newsletters and lives about menopause. And here's what she said. Hi, Jack. Your post about perimenopause in the workplace resonates and raises questions about what I've been experiencing in my workplace. I am 49 and recently able to put the puzzle pieces together that I have been coping with perimenopause symptoms misdiagnosed as depression last May and June. Meanwhile, I have been placed on a PIP, that's a performance improvement plan,
Sure.
at work for my inability to, quote, manage tasks, unquote, which I can firmly now say is a result of my symptoms. I've been successful in my career, receiving promotions and stellar reviews. This is the first time in my career mention of and being placed on a PIP came up. So, perfect example, her 35-year-old male boss wrote her up. PIPs, by the way, most people don't recover from. It's a tool that companies use to performance manage you out the door. So here, she's being managed out because of these perimenopause symptoms. And isn't that a shame? If she had known that these were the symptoms related to perimenopause and menopause and had gone to the company, not the manager itself, but to HR and said, I'm dealing with these issues right now that are interfering with my ability to fully and optimally perform the essential functions of my job, she would have been entitled to flexibility, and they would not have put her on a PIP because that would have been illegal backlash for her protected requests for flexibility. So again, the short version of this, that the ADA protects you also, it's only affecting women. So it's a sex-based protected claim, and it's only affecting mostly women of a certain age or women of a certain stage, as my colleague always points out. And so you have this intersectional sex, age, and disability, like sort of, holy trinity of protected claims. It is also known as a sex plus claim, meaning it's sex plus another category of protection, in this case, age or disability. So these are already there. We're finding this with clients in New York. Yes, New York City has a more liberal human rights statute than federal law, but there's no question in New York you're protected when you're in perimenopause. And our thesis has been, and we've been saying this over and over again until it finally clicks, and no one can contest it, that these symptoms, it's not menopause, menopause itself isn't a disability, but the symptoms often are.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Wow. It's shocking. And I'm like, again, I'm a business professional. I'm educated. I've gone through this. I've worked in HR over 20 years. I've never thought of it in this way, in terms of protecting someone or them being protected, right, from having symptoms that are real and identifiable and diagnosable. Can Catherine, could you maybe talk a little bit about, from the perspective of what can employers be doing now that we're trying to get the word out that this is a protected class if someone comes to you and says they have these diagnoses? Is this something employers can be even proactive with so that they can better support people before it gets to the point of, to Jack's point of putting someone on a performance improvement plan?
I mean, that's the dream, right? The dream is that we do know that most individuals hit this in a certain time frame of their life. So we have a general idea of when many people are going to be going through this. And obviously, surgical based menopause does happen for some people sooner. But I do think employers kind of know a relative age frame when many of their employees are going through this. And it's making a comfortable environment for those employees where they, one, feel comfortable reporting that they're going through this, because not every woman's going to start it at one specific time. Symptoms may come and go over time. So employers do really need to create an environment where it's not hostile to talk about, the female reproductive cycle and what's going on as far as that goes. And also recognizing that these are conversations that they're going to need to have with employees about figuring out what accommodations are reasonable for both sides. Whether that means more breaks for an employee, shifting hours because maybe they're able to sleep better in the morning. So maybe they're coming in a bit later and working more into the night when they have that insomnia. It might mean offering more opportunities to sit if their body's hurting more and that's available at work. So it really can look very different. I know Jack was very disheartened recently. We had some individuals come to us. They are school teachers and they actually removed the window air conditioning units from their classrooms. And these teachers are going through menopause, they're having hot flashes, they're in a hot environment now, and they don't even have air conditioners. So it's really just thinking about the things we can do to make the environment comfortable for people that aren't far reaches necessarily, and keeping the environment also comfortable to talk in.
I love those.
Yeah, Jack, you talked about these challenges and how existing civil rights and workplace laws sort of exist already. And maybe a lot of people don't know about it, or employers don't understand that they apply, right? The laws that apply in other areas and other folks with certain disabilities. Are there other ways, or are there new specific pieces of legislation that are being discussed or have been discussed
Yes.
to talk about these issues more directly, to make it less opaque, maybe?
Yes. Well, first of all, there is a piece of legislation that Catherine and I are working on, and our team presented to Congress in July in a Women's Midlife Health and Menopause Conference in the House of Representatives, Congress, talking about the proposal for a Menopause Workers Fairness Act. And this Menopause Workers Fairness Act is based on the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act that just became law last June 2023. And there's an entire fascinating history that's similar to menopause. And because I spent the last 25 years in that space, banging my head against the wall when employers would say, your client's not entitled. Lawyers I would talk to say, who said your client's entitled to maternity leave? Pregnancy is not a disability. She's not qualified. She's not eligible under the FMLA because she hasn't worked here a full year before her water breaks. And we may not have 50 employees, so she's not covered. She doesn't have enough accrued time. What are you talking about? You don't get maternity leave. And I would say, hello, don't you realize that? And they would say, by the way, pregnancy is not a disability, and it's elective. So we would say, well, wait a minute. If somebody worked for a month for your company and they broke their leg or had a heart attack or long COVID or whatever, you wouldn't fire them and say you can't take leave because you haven't worked here for a year or we're not big enough for the FMLA. It would be disability discrimination. How is this different for women who even insurance companies say postpartum, you're disabled for at least 6 weeks, minimally vaginal delivery, and 8 weeks for cesarean section? So it's sex and disability discrimination. They would ultimately cave. We brought lawsuits. These cases would eventually settle. If not, we would win them.
Yeah.
But finally, we get to the point where and it's another, probably not for today, a story about Peggy Young versus the UPS. It went to the Supreme Court in 2015. The Supreme Court said, these are the problems with the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This is why this keeps happening to women. They're not exactly entitled to accommodations, even though others are. Like at UPS, if you lost your license because you were drunk driving, they would give you light duty. If you were pregnant and needed light duty, they would say, no soup for you, sister.
Wow.
So finally, from that decision in 2015, from a Supreme Court that wouldn't do it in today's Supreme Court, we have the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act for pregnant women. And it talks to all of these issues of how women related medical conditions to pregnancy itself is now protected. You don't need to have a high risk pregnancy, but anything that you do need during your gestational cycle is accommodatable in the workplace. You're entitled to maternity leave. And the sister statute that passed last year, the PUMP Act, providing urgent maternal protections for nursing mothers, now allows 9 million more women to safely, privately express milk in the workplace for a year postpartum. So from that framework, because menopause and perimenopause are just the bookend stages of a woman's reproductive life cycle, why wouldn't they be protected too? They're related medical conditions to reproduction. We presented this bill. 2 Congresswomen are interested in it. One, we're not in a position yet to name her, but one of them we've been working with in the EEOC on this bill. Now, we're not encouraged, given the current incoming administration, that the new chief of the EEOC is against all these things. The new incoming chair doesn't believe that menopause, abortion, miscarriage, and fertility should be covered among other. I mean, it's just a reality.
Yeah.
But we're still working on the bill. And if and when this bill ultimately passes, menopause, like pregnancy itself, will be a protected status. But now, just like pregnancy in days of yore, we have to do all of these workarounds, but doesn't mean it's still not protected.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like we need to, it isn't just one conversation, right? This is something we should be talking about on a regular cadence to inform not just employers, but the women themselves.
Right.
From all the way, because I think that you're talking about it. I'm thinking back to, I worked in a large professional services firm when I was pregnant, went on bed rest in the hospital, and I was still working. People were coming to the hospital to resign to me. I was still working. And I was in HR. I should have known better, right? And that was 20 years ago. So
Right.
I think that part of it is educating the women in the work world of
Right.
what their rights are, all the way from pregnancy, all the way through menopause. Catherine, I'd love to hear your perspective, and obviously being a doula as well, as a lawyer in this topic area. Could you talk a little bit just about the stigma or the culture that we're working in right now? And you've given us some ideas of what employers can do proactively, which is super helpful. But what can maybe from the actual woman's perspective, the employee's perspective, what can they be doing to better educate and change this stigma of maybe asking for help?
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story, Trish, because I think that is part of what we have to do as women is share some of the challenges we go through. Because I think sometimes employers just don't know what you're going through, right? And there is a degree of bravery that women have to take in having these conversations. Particularly some women in certain jobs know when you mention that you're pregnant or you mention that you're menopausal, that is not going to be looked on favorably in certain work environments. And so it does take a degree of bravery to walk into that environment and say, this describes me. I am entitled to certain rights, and it's so I can be the best employer I can be, and the best employee I can be. And I think sometimes what happens is that it gets lost in communication, that this is all really trying to help each other, right? If we can find the right accommodations, if we can do those things, then people are keeping their jobs, they're being productive. We know it's actually more productive for companies to keep good, solid workers longer. So, when people are going through pregnancy, when they're going through menopause, if we can accommodate them for short periods of time, then the end result is beneficial for both the individual and the company. So I think keeping that in mind, I think women need to really help each other find their tribes. Something I see a lot in both the pregnancy and the menopause space is women feel very alone. Those can be lonely journeys to be going through. And so we do need to find people who understand us, who support us, and will help give us the confidence to talk to people about what we're going through and ask for the assistance we need during those times. Because employers aren't mind readers. They don't necessarily know everything that you need until you tell them.
Right. I think too, having employers that are male, like Steve, like Jack, who are open to it. I mean, Steve and I have worked together for, gosh, almost a decade. And as I was going through it, like I think that's why we started doing the shows, right? So Steve is someone who stepped up and started learning as well. So he's learning right alongside me. So I think the answer isn't that the employer has to know all the right answers.
But
They
here's
just
the
have,
interesting thing, and I have sort of a question and a comment I'll make about that, Trish. The
yeah.
first time we did a show on menopause was the MIDI Health show, I believe, right?
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys are aware or familiar
Mhm.
with MIDI Health at all, but we had this founder of MIDI Health on, and we talked about menopause and some of the issues around health, the healthcare side of it, and employer sponsoring some of the services and coverages and et cetera. And I remember saying at the time, like, this is the most I've ever talked about this topic in my entire life. It's the most I've ever heard about it. I didn't know anything about it other than menopause. I knew the word and I thought hot flashes. It's the only things I would have ever been exposed to just as a male in my sort of position. And so it was enlightening, certainly for me, but I gotta believe so many other guys who are managers and directors and VPs or business owners are in that same position. They just have never really thought about it all that much. And secondly, Trish, I want to ask you, you were an HR leader for a really, really long time. In all the companies you were doing HR in, did anybody ever come to you, an employee, and ask for one of these kinds of accommodations related
Never
to
once.
menopause? Yeah, that's what I'm
No,
thinking.
never
It's
once.
interesting. And you did HR for a
So
long time.
I did. And I think that's why like these shows are important. We have to try and figure out how do we educate both sides of the equation. Until I went to MIDI Health, I thought it was going crazy. I'm not even kidding you. Like the whole Jackie talked about the brain fog and the, just it is beyond hot flashes, right? It's the mood swings and being anxious when maybe you've never been anxious before in your life and you feel like your performance is slipping. I would go to Steve and say, like randomly, I can't do this today. I
Mhm.
don't know why. I just can't, I'm not 100% today. And luckily he was like, okay. But if I was working in a corporate setting, I definitely would not do that. I wouldn't feel comfortable. So I guess, Jack, what can we do now, right? Next steps. If I'm listening to this show, whether I'm the employer side or maybe I'm a woman who's wanting to use, my rights, what can I do to support like this future legislation you're working on? What can I do to be more supportive to this overall movement, if you will?
Well, first of all, people need to be aware, and I'm just saying this without being overly political, that um, right now, and those who, voted for the current incoming administration voted against their own basic self-interest in every level, and people just aren't aware of it. They aren't aware that a judge just disallowed 4 million workers in Texas this month from receiving overtime pay because of a decision that just said, like, tough noogies, we're here, I'm for the businesses.
Yeah.
So, right now, it's nothing they could do particularly with this legislation. It's not like they could call, a congressperson yet. I think what really need to be aware of is that you are protected. We have to normalize and untabooize this whole notion of like the ickiness of these things, from like menses to menopause. Nobody wants to talk about it. Even women will say it's none of their freaking business. I
Yeah.
don't want to talk about it. And again, when you were an HR person, I assume, Trish, there was nothing in the handbook that said a thing about menopause. So women don't, they are dissuaded and they're intimidated to say anything. So we do have to get to the point where it's not shameful to step up. When you were talking about your symptoms, which you weren't even sure, a lot of times women will say, I just don't feel like myself.
That's
That's
it.
the extent of it. And it's like, if you don't feel like yourself and you haven't yet, people go to, like, this woman in the DM, she went to her OBGYN who said, it's in your head, take a Xanax. It's not.
Yes.
Right. So if you go to a menopause aware practitioner on the Menopause Society's website, um, they have certified menopause aware practitioners all over the country, a list.
Yeah.
You can find someone, get a diagnosis. The first thing you should do is understand that you're in this stage and it could happen earlier than you expected. And again, women we don't talk about it in the culture. So it's like shameful. So therefore, it's another one of these secrets in a culture that is kind of, a little patriarchal,
Yeah.
right? And so we don't really give credence to, I've said for decades, I say this to juries in my pregnancy cases, if men could get pregnant, the Family and Medical Leave Act would be 12 months long and fully paid. And when I make that statement in my voir dire, what do you think? They all laugh.
Yeah.
I don't have to say anything else because everybody knows it's true. The same thing would be if men went through andropause the way that women go through menopause with the same type of severity of symptoms. We'd have hormone spas in the workplace and retreats. And it's because we all know that, women just, when it comes to women's health and women's rights, in this culture, we're not exactly top of the food chain on those issues. So I'm not sure I answered. What was your question? What can women do? You know what? Be aware that instead of being managed out the door or self-exiling, so many women quit. It costs billions of dollars to women in companies. 20% of the workforce are women 45 to 64. So when you have these great numbers of women going through it, this quiet suffering, understand that to the extent before you're written up for not being able to manage tasks, the way they come to expect of you, you can request, and you should request, a reasonable accommodation. And let me repeat, the reason that you're doing this and you're saying to your company, it's HIPAA protected. You're not announcing it on Slack.
Right.
You're going to HR with it, and you're saying, assuming there is an HR, but the top of the company's food chain, and saying, listen, these are the issues. It's a medical condition, and I need support. And this is what I may need. As Catherine said, you have a discussion. That's the interactive process. And even if they say, here's the thing, if they say no, your request was still a civil rights protected ask. And so if things go further south, and I don't want this to happen to anyone, but this is how you can have a claim. This is how your company, if the marriage can't be saved, so to speak, don't you want to get severance? Because the company will be aware if they're terminating you after, or demoting you or not promoting you after this type of protected request, it's illegal. So are we willing to stand up for ourselves? And again, it's like half the population is women and the other half presumably likes a woman or two in their life. Why aren't we all on the same page about this? This is like fundamental stuff here. And don't we all care that our daughters and wives and sisters and girlfriends and ourselves are finally seen and respected throughout the entirety of our professional lives?
Yeah, Jack, thank you for that passionate kind of articulation of this issue. And Trish, I was just getting ready to record a little Workplace Minute show, which is another little show we do, Jack and Catherine. And it's about, I was just reading the 10th annual Women in the Workplace report that Lean In and McKinsey put out. So they've been doing it for 10 years, and they look at things like breakdown of executive CEOs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, in 10 years, hardly any progress has been made in terms of the percentage of women who are CEOs at really big companies, percentage of women who are in the C-suite at really big companies. And Jack, when you said 20% of the workforce is women age 45 to 64, that's who CEOs are, right? In C-suite people, in VPs, et cetera. That's about the range, right? You kind of work your way up if you want to, and that's when you should be advancing into those really big roles if that's what you're after. And these issues, and the Lean In report doesn't even mention it, right? I read the whole thing yesterday. It doesn't even talk about any of these issues once, and I gotta believe this is a significant contributor to at least some of those gender disparities that we see, particularly in those C-suite, VP, and CEO levels, right?
Sure.
It's gotta be. Yeah.
Well, it's gotta be. And it is, because I represent some of these women, and I know that this is when women are at the top of their game in leadership. I'm speaking in December to the Chiefs, the Organization of Women in Leadership, about these issues, because they're aware that there's no place to go with them, and no one understands, no one really fully, it's not yet, what we want is for this to be kind of common knowledge.
Yeah.
Because no one yet has ever said, there's no lawyer that will say, you're wrong about that. It's just that you have to put the pieces together and be willing to walk the talk. Menopause symptoms, perimenopause symptoms are protected. Not all of them, if you just have, but the ones that affect your, how many dozens of symptoms are there? There are dozens in every fundamental area, right? Cognitive, physical, emotional, mental. everything is affected and can be affected. And while it's manageable, postmenopausal women are often not going through this any longer. So this is where the temporary, the notion of I need support temporarily until I'm on HRT, for example, until I get this stuff down pat,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
all we're saying, so that you don't lose your job. Just like women, they get pregnant and the company looks at it as, wait a minute, that's not in our best interest. We're going to have to accommodate you. We're going to have to give you 3 months of maternity leave, and then we have to hold the job open for you. How is that in a
Yeah.
profit over people culture? How is that in our best interest? So they find ways to get rid of these employees. Even when they use algorithms, these employees, pregnant women, women in menopause, often get selected. So yes, we all have our work cut out for us.
Yeah. Well, I love it that it's still a challenge, right? And there's room to grow and there's room to educate on both sides of that equation. It gives me hope because the very fact that we're able to talk about this openly and without stigma attached to it. I remember going to my mom and asking her about menopause, and she goes, I don't think I went through that. So I think a lot of people, I think a lot of people who are in it right
Right.
now might have come from a similar background. So it's not even just that it wasn't talked about. Women didn't even know they were having it.
Right.
They,
Well,
Right.
and I would stress, Trish, that there is a range of menopause symptoms for people, right? And
right,
so some people do feel it very severely, and
right,
those are definitely the people that we're really advocating need these protections. And
yeah,
some people, you may not have as severe symptoms, and you may not feel the need to go to your boss and talk about it because it may not impact your job performance, and
right,
that's fine too.
yeah.
It's okay, whatever your experience is. It's recognizing that experiences can be different and that we want to be there for the people who need it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I liked
This,
how you talked about making everyone comfortable. And really, that's our goal with all of our employees, right? And I think if you are talking about making the women in your workforce more comfortable as they go through different medical changes in their bodies, that's also going to have a ripple effect. It's going to make the men's jobs easier as well, right? Because everyone's going to feel more understood, more included, right? It's sort of that trickle down theory in terms of what's good for one protected class is actually usually good for everyone when you think
yeah.
about it.
Yeah. This has been great stuff, guys. We could probably go for a while on this, and maybe like Trish said at the
We need
top,
another
like we're
update, I
gonna have
think.
to invite you guys back in a few months, and maybe certainly if we get an update on any progress happening with the bill you guys are trying to advance, we'd love to know about that too. Maybe do even a short
Yes.
update on that. But Jack and Catherine, so wonderful to have you. Great conversation. Jack, I'll throw it to you. Folks who want to learn more, connect with you, the firm, et cetera, just find you. You mentioned you're on LinkedIn all the time. Where would you like folks to come find you?
Well, Catherine and I are on LinkedIn. I'm active on LinkedIn. I'm on TikTok. You can
There you
find us
go.
in any of these social
Good.
medias. I talk a lot about menopause there. But particularly on LinkedIn, we do weekly. I just got off of a live talking about don't quit when you have menopause symptoms.
Nice.
Also, our website is womensrightsny.com. And if anyone wants to reach out by email, we're at info@womensrightsny, like NewYork.com, womensrightsny.com. So,
Awesome.
happy to hear from you, particularly if you're going through some menopause or pregnancy issues and need some support.
Love it. Thank you, Jack. Catherine, same with you. Find you on LinkedIn.
Yep. Track us down through the info email address. We love to answer questions. We love to support people however we can. So
Awesome.
please reach out.
This has been fantastic. It's been great to meet you guys. Great conversation. I'm glad we were able to do it. Trish, great stuff. And I learned even more today about menopause. So I'm getting there, Jack. I'm getting there. And I think it's good for all men, honestly.
Yeah,
It's certainly of our age, right? To open up your minds a little bit and just don't act like this isn't a real thing just because it's not happening to you. And sometimes you can't really see it. I was thinking about like some of the disability stuff we've talked about over the years, and some of it's so obvious, right? Because we've done shows about people who are blind, people who are deaf, physically disabled, and we could see the ramp that we make the company build, right? Up to the steps. It's obvious, but this stuff, we don't see it. It's a little more complex, but it doesn't mean it's not as important.
And to that point, Steve, if people want to read more, there's a law professor at Catherine's alma mater, the University of San Francisco Law School. Michelle Travis wrote 4 pieces for Forbes this year on menopause. I'm quoted in all of them. And the last one is about male allyship.
Okay.
Like, where are the men?
Yeah.
Where are the men in this? Because, it's not just something that's their problem. It's,
Yeah.
women's rights are human rights and all of that.
Yeah. I dig it. All right. So we're going to do our part too. We're going to keep doing these kinds of shows and share them far and wide. So Jack and Catherine, again, thanks so much. We'll put the links in the show notes to find you guys and connect with you. Trish, great stuff. Thank you. Thanks to our friends at Paychex. I'm wearing my Paychex hat today. They're awesome and we appreciate them. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and go to hrhappyhour.net for all the show archives. So for our guests, for Trish, my name's Steve Bose. Thanks so much for listening to At Work in America. We will see you next time, and bye for now.